Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, whatever is appropriate. My name is Meredith McQuaid, and I have the pleasure of serving as the University of Minnesota's Associate Vice President and Dean for International Programs. And welcome to today's webinar that M Global Presents has been putting on. M Global Presents allows us to highlight the unique and exciting initiatives going on internationally across the University of Minnesota. And today's webinar, I'm really excited about. The title is Why World Languages Matter in Social Justice Education. And I think an appropriate subtitle would be, This is Not Your Mother's Language Course. And that's likely a good thing. So we have a terrific panel of experts with us today. Kate Paisani, who is the director of CARLA, which is the Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition, and affiliate associate professor in the College of Liberal Arts. We also have Lauren Goodspeed, who is a lecturer in the Department of French and Italian. We have Mandy Menke, associate professor, Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies. And we have Helena Roof, a senior lecturer in the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch. I'm so excited for the topic. These women are the best suited to deliver this webinar, and I hope you enjoy it. And thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Meredith, and thanks everybody for coming today. We just want to take a moment to thank the GPS Alliance team for putting this webinar together and for inviting us to do this. We are both delighted and daunted by the number of people who are here today, but we really are grateful for your attendance, and we look forward to your comments and questions at the end of the webinar. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview and some context for the discussion that we're going to have today. Meredith mentioned that I'm the director of the Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition, or CARLA, and our mission is to improve language teaching and learning. And one of the projects that we are currently working on is related to social justice and language education. And all of our projects are grounded in current research in second language acquisition and language pedagogy. And our aim is to create resources and professional development experiences for teachers. So our social justice project is one of those areas that we're doing that work in. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. But before we get started today, like I said, I want to provide just a little bit of context. And the first thing I want to do is talk about our choice to use the term world languages in the title of this webinar. The terminology around language education is actually quite complex. People use the term foreign languages, second languages, world languages, majority and minority languages, less commonly taught languages, and even within our profession, there is discussion and debate about appropriate terminology to use. We are coming into this webinar as post-secondary educators in the United States, teaching languages other than English, an educational context in which the terms world languages and foreign languages are used to refer to the work that we do. We've chosen world languages because this has become a much more prevalent term in both K-12 and post-secondary contexts. And we've chosen it because we find it to be a more inclusive term than foreign, which tends to otherize people and the cultures that they represent. And so through our choice of the word world languages, we recognize that all languages are valuable and that all languages are worthy of consideration when discussing intersections between languages and social justice education. We also want to acknowledge our own positionality and privilege in relation to the topic of social justice in language education. All four of us are white women living in the United States and working at a land-grant university located on Dakota land. We also teach and speak dominant European languages, English, German, French, and Spanish. So these aspects of our identity, both our positionality and the educational context in which we work, influence how we think about language education and how we will engage with the topic of today's webinar. I do want to say, however, that we'll be speaking generally about language education today, but drawing on our experiences as French, German, and Spanish teachers to provide some examples. So why are we doing a webinar on languages and social justice? Over the past 20 years, we've seen in language education a real shift in goals and approaches. And the shift has been from a focus on developing students' ability to communicate appropriately to carry out real-world tasks like buying train tickets or asking for directions, to a focus on critical and culturally responsive pedagogies that prioritize language development for the purposes of engaging with target language cultures and of recognizing and honoring students' multilingual and multicultural identities. These critical and culturally responsive pedagogies also seek to provide equitable access to educational opportunities in order to prepare students to engage in their current and future academic, professional, personal, and civic lives. So with this interest in critical and culturally responsive pedagogies, we wanted to carry out a project on social justice education. And so we last year developed and were awarded funding for a grant project whose aim is to create materials that develop students' intercultural understanding, language proficiency, and career competencies through the exploration of social justice themes in 9 languages. And these languages are Arabic, Chinese, Dutch, French, German, Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, and Turkish. So the 4 of us who are here today in the webinar are the leaders of this grant project, and we're working with curriculum developers in all of these languages over the next 2.5 years to develop these materials that will be disseminated to a national and international audience through the Carla website. Through our work on this grant project, one of our primary aims has been to educate ourselves to be more effective and knowledgeable social justice teachers and teacher educators. But we recognize that this is ongoing work that will extend well beyond the 3-year grant project that we are conducting, and in fact will be a lifelong pursuit for us. So just the last bit of context that we want to provide is our definition of social justice and social justice education. So Jennifer, if you could put up the first slide for us, please. Okay. So we draw on work by Sonia Nieto, who has been very influential in the area of social justice and language education. And we use her definition of social justice as a philosophy, an approach, and actions that embody treating all people with fairness, respect, dignity, and generosity. To put this definition into practice, Nieto has proposed 4 components of social justice education. First, it challenges, confronts, and disrupts misconceptions, untruths, and stereotypes that lead to structural inequality and discrimination. Second, it provides all students with the resources necessary to learn to their full potential. Next, it draws on the talents and strengths students bring to their education. And finally, it creates a learning environment that promotes critical thinking and agency for social change. So in fact, this way of putting social justice into practice in the classroom is consistent with the critical and culturally responsive pedagogies that I mentioned just a moment ago. So Jennifer, if you could just move to the next slide, please. So our aim today is to explore some of the questions we as a group have been asking ourselves to get at why world languages matter in social justice education. And so to meet that aim, we've structured the webinar with this brief introduction that I've just provided, and then we'll have an informal discussion among the 4 of us, followed by Q&A from you, the audience. So the questions that we're going to be exploring today are listed on the slide, and I'll just go ahead and read them. So the first question is, why are languages crucial to understanding different perspectives? Second, how do languages help us connect with others across cultures? Third, how do languages play both an empowering and marginalizing role in relation to social justice education? Fourth, why are language courses an important site for exploring social justice issues? And then finally, if we have time, we'll talk about some examples about how these ideas can be realized in a language class. So as I mentioned at the end of the discussion, we'll entertain your questions. We hope we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. I do want to mention that we have a range of folks in attendance at the webinar today, representing lots of different audiences. So of course, we have folks from post-secondary academic context, but we also have community members here. We have practicing teachers. So the group here is not just specialists in language education. So we ask that you just keep that in mind as you think about the questions that you might want to ask. And we certainly won't be able to entertain all of your questions given the large number of people who are in attendance today, but we'll do our best to get at those that seem to be popping up as being popular among the group. Okay, so Jennifer, we can stop screen sharing now and go ahead and see everybody on the screen. So I'm going to start with our first question, and Helena is going to begin by answering it. And the question is, why are languages crucial to helping us understand other perspectives?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. That's a very interesting question. First off, I think it's important to note that language is not neutral. Language is used in many ways to convince, to entertain, to connect, to inform. And in language, we work most often with texts of all forms. And when we encounter a text, we must always consider who the creator of that text is, what their goals or purposes are for communication, and how they position the consumers of the text that they produce. Language is thus a tool to both maintain and question power relationships. And by engaging in such critical practices vis-a-vis texts and teaching students to do so as well, we are granted insight into societal structures and issues of power. We also gain diverse perspectives on topics and see how those perspectives are culturally embedded through the cultural narratives present in texts in the specific language forms, such as vocabulary, grammatical structure, genre features that an author uses to relay those cultural narratives. So language is a powerful tool that can be used to express one's perspective. And then through careful analysis of that language, we thus gain a better understanding of the perspectives of others.
And Helena, can I just jump in for a sec and ask for some clarification about how you're defining a text, just so our audience knows what we mean by that?
Right. And I tried to be careful and say many I mean, I think a text can be anything that we think of from, a book or a short story, but a text could also be an advertisement or just an image, a movie. Many different things can be texts. And that's what we work with a lot in our language courses.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that, just in case folks know.
Good.
Lauren, did you want to jump in and add something to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of try to give a simple sort of concrete example of what it might look like for language to sort of play with, question, maintain different power dynamics. So one thing that came to mind for me is the use of tu versus vous in French. And this is common across a lot of different languages to have two different forms of you, one that is more informal and one that is more formal. And the choice between which one we use can signal closeness, it can signal distance, reverence, mutual respect. In fact, I've seen sort of a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but flow charts of how to choose between each form of you based on different sort of social situations. And just from my personal experience, I can share that I spent some time teaching English as a teaching assistant in France. And when I first arrived, I was very careful to always use the formal form of you with the teachers I was working with to sort of demonstrate respect for them and acknowledge our sort of difference in positioning. And then one of the teachers one day sort of took me aside and said, "Why are you using vous with us? Just use tu, like we're all equals here, we're all colleagues." And when I came back to the United States to my graduate program, I noticed a big contrast where professors and students often used vous with each other to this formal you to really symbolize mutual respect. So it wasn't necessarily a distance thing, but just to say, I respect you. So contextually that could change too. But that was just one example that I thought of how language, a seemingly simple choice, can really question or maintain different sort of power dynamics.
I think that was a really good example, Lauren, of kind of how we use language to position ourselves too, right? And so we can see an individual's perspective and how their perspective on how they relate to whoever they're interacting with through language. And really, language is what separates us as human beings from the other animals, the other beings that inhabit Earth with us. It's really at the heart of the human experience. And language what you highlighted in that example is how dynamic it is and how we're constantly negotiating and reconstructing and revisiting how we use language. That language is not something that exists outside of humans, right? It's not this independent entity, but it's something that we co-construct together. And so it really does provide us a unique lens through which we can understand and explore how individuals, communities, societies both experience the world around them and make sense of the world around them. And it's fun sometimes to look at how language reflects those different realities, so to speak. And this is a really common example that gets cited a lot, but we have the example of how many different words, for example, the Inuits have to express snow, right? And for somebody that lives maybe in a more tropical climate, that is kind of mind-blowing because you only need one word. You don't have to talk about this very much. But when you have this communicative need in a different community to really distinguish between different types of snow, of precipitation, because it impacts your reality, it impacts what you choose to do, what you don't do that day, where you store your food, et cetera, et cetera. You need to find ways, linguistic ways to communicate that. So that's one example. And so like you could see how the perspectives might be embedded in that language. Similarly, I'm thinking of another example. I remember learning in one of my linguistics classes about Quechua speakers. And Quechua is an indigenous language that's spoken in South America. And one of the things that those communities value is the source of information. So it's really important when you're telling a story to know how you know this information. So whether you experienced it as yourself, or whether you've come through this information secondhand and learned about it through another channel. And so they encode how they learned about this information in the grammar of the language. So when they're talking, they'll include a different morpheme, a different grammatical piece of information into their speech to communicate that. And so like as an outsider, that's not on my radar, right? Like I don't think about encoding that, but it does give me perspective into that community and into that society and what they value. And so this is part of what makes learning a second language so hard, is that you're not just learning new words to map onto your reality, but you're learning about new realities, new ways of meaning, new ways of seeing the world. And so that's why it can be really hard, because you just feel like, I can't express what I want to express because maybe that the language you're learning doesn't allow you to do that, or vice versa. You don't quite make the same meaning as someone from that community because of the way you interpret, whether it be the vocabulary, the grammar, whatever it is. Language is just really culturally embedded. And so when we use language and learn about language, we can really get insight into both what matters into a certain community and what doesn't matter, as well as their relationships between individuals and between societies and civilizations.
Yeah, and Mandy, I think your answer, connects with what Helena was saying about bringing in a broad range of text types, in the sense that it allows us to look at the perspectives and voices of people who might not necessarily be included in a more traditional language curriculum. So I really appreciate the example of the indigenous language that you mentioned, because it allows us to consider different perspectives and different voices. And we could look at the art from that particular community, or the folklore from that community if they don't have a written tradition, to be able to get a window into not only language use, but also the way that they perceive the world through language, right? Okay, so let's move on to our second question. And again, Helena's gonna start off with an answer to this one. And that question is, how do languages help us connect with others across cultures?
Yeah, and I think for me, when I think about this question, I first come, back to ourselves. And there's definitely a very strong connection between language and identity. And for multilingual or multi-dialectal speakers, the choice of which language or dialect to use when is very much tied up with their identity and how they see themselves in relation to the world around them. And language is also strongly connected to our own cultural identity, of course, as well. And I think the one thing I've been working on a lot in this past year, I think, and thinking about is when we embark on social justice work, it is of utmost importance to first analyze our own identities and to think about who we are and our ways of being in the world. And thus, through the study of languages and cultures, we learn when we're learning about other cultures and other languages, we learn different ways of being and doing in this world, and we gain insight into through that we gain insight into our own home culture or cultures in relation to the target languages and cultures that we are learning about. And I think that these moments of critical reflection help us first and foremost to better understand ourselves, and that's really important in this work, and then to understand our own cultures, which then in turn helps us to better connect with other people.
Yeah, I have to agree with you, Helena, that the first thing that I think about is the fact that language is so tied to our identities. And in particular, I think about this study that I learned about, work that's been done by Dr. Gail Prasad with children's conceptions of their plurilingualism in Canada. And she did this really cool project where she asked students to create these linguistic and cultural self-portraits where they were given a black and white image of themselves, and they colored in their images with different colors in different parts of their bodies to represent their different linguistic and cultural identities, all the different pieces of it, and sort of how they relate to it, using the body as a metaphor. So you might see their feet colored in a specific color, or maybe their hands and their head colored in another color, and their sort of core, their trunk and their heart colored in a third color. And all of the students had very unique self-portraits, so they all reflected sort of their individual linguistic and cultural identities. But one commonality that she noticed was that there was always a very meaningful language that was at the student's core, at their heart or their trunk. And it was often a first language or maybe a heritage language that had been lost and the student hoped to regain access to. So I think this is just such a beautiful illustration of how tied languages are to our identities. And one other thing that I thought was important was that in this study, Dr. Prasad talked about how these children were really validated by the experience of reflecting on and thinking about their identities as plurilinguals. There was one student who said, oh, no one has ever asked me to talk about the fact that I speak Swahili. And so I think through this sort of project, this sort of exploration, we can see how validating someone's languages is an important component of validating their identity as well, and also understanding their experience, as Mandy alluded to earlier.
Yeah, that answer, Lauren, actually, there's a question in the Q&A already that I think we might want to entertain now because it's really related to what you and Helena were both saying. And the question is, can we elaborate on the way that language constructs personhood and how this is important when we think about equitably narrating or re-narrating marginalized lived experiences? Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, I think you've talked a little bit about this idea of personhood. I can just talk about my own personal experience as a child of as a second generation Italian, and my father's connection to language with his family and how that shaped all of his interactions with his parents. It shaped the way that he talked about his childhood. He would use Italian words when he was talking about his childhood. And it was that this idea of being at the heart, like you were talking about with that example. I mean, that's a very small example, but I think it was also for him connected to the way that he was marginalized in the society in which he grew up, where Italians were seen as lower than others that were living in his small community. But maybe you guys have other ideas about this.
I think that relates really well to something else that I was thinking about that I'm not sure if this really gets at what the question is asking, but the fact that we are better able to recount experiences that we had in the language that we had them in. So if we have an experience in English, for example, we are best able to relate that experience and sort of explain that experience in English versus a different language. Or even the fact that often people come back to their most dominant language, I guess, in situations where they're thinking about their emotions or when emotions are really high. So I think that's just sort of an illustration of how sort of important languages can be to those really foundational experiences.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to our next question then. And Lauren's going to start with this one. And the question is, how do languages play both an empowering and marginalizing role in relation to social justice education?
Yeah, and so I'll speak a little bit more about sort of the empowering side. And I think especially as a teacher of a commonly taught language, for me, I think about the fact that incorporating social justice into the foreign language classroom or the world language classroom really challenges us as educators to move beyond standard or prestige varieties of the languages that we teach. So we learned that, or we see that we need to represent or make visible communities that use varieties that might be effaced or in some cases even looked down upon and marginalized. So in the case of French, for example, thinking about how do I represent not just France's French, which of course is broad in and of itself and encompasses a huge number of things, but also different parts of the French speaking world, which is also enormous. And I also just sort of want to shout out a little bit to graduate students in the French department who got me thinking about this in another way, and my colleagues, that we also need to think about languages that are in close contact with the languages that we teach, instead of just specifically the languages that we teach. So we might think about Indigenous languages in Canada, Creoles in the Caribbean, Wolof and Berber in North Africa, to sort of provide learners with a more accurate understanding of the entire linguistic landscape in the cultures that we're teaching about, and representing a wide variety of communities and cultures connected to the languages that they're learning. And sort of like as another note, I think that this is important because it gives learners access to a wide variety of languages and styles, so that they can make more informed choices about the language that they use in different contexts. And for some of them, maybe even see themselves more in the languages that we're teaching.
Yeah, and I think just to jump in, because I'm looking at the Q&A and there are lots of questions about this particular topic. And I think the kinds of examples you're providing, Lauren, allow an opportunity to help students understand the impact of colonialism on language spread across the world, and what that has meant for the peoples and societies in these countries where, for instance, the French have colonized. And what that has meant over time for the development or maintenance of indigenous languages versus the dominant language of the colonizer, et cetera. So I appreciate that example.
Right. And even how people in those communities relate to French.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So Mandy, I think you were going to take the marginalizing part, right?
Yeah. So I was going to take the second half of that question, right? Thinking through how the marginalizing role that language can play. And I think we've commented multiple times at this point that identity is wrapped up, it's entwined with our language. It is both reflected in the language we choose to speak, as well as the patterns of our language use. And part of this is because of the different associations that individuals make with the different groups that speak a certain way. So if we think about, I'm just going to go with the US context here. So not even thinking about languages used in other areas, but I'm going to stick with kind of English here in the US for the moment. We make judgments about individuals who speak English as their first language based on the dialect that they speak. So for example, those who speak Southern English, who speak with a Southern drawl, as we often call it, are often judged, and they've done research on this, judged to be friendlier, but they're also judged to be less intelligent just based on the sounds of their speech. Similarly, there's a sizable body of research out there that looks about how individuals who speak African American vernacular English are judged and what communities they're associated with. And often they're associated again with being uneducated and even not part of the American culture. And so those implicit or unconscious judgments that we make are one thing, but what happens next, what decisions then, how we act on those is what's problematic, right? And that's where the marginalization really comes in. And so there are reports about individuals being denied access to employment because of the way they speak. We have reports of students being denied access to different educational opportunities. And so this is a way that language is kind of used as a litmus test to exclude people from certain areas, certain domains of our society. And so those examples were really from monolingual, is what I'm thinking, speakers of English, but we can think about it too with our bilingual speakers. So I work in Spanish, and we can think about the Latinx or Hispanic populations here within the US. And oftentimes these individuals grow up bilingually. Their English may be accented by their Spanish because they grow up in a multilingual community where people move between languages. And so when children enter school, then they have different opportunities available to them, or they have opportunities taken away from them because of the fact that they speak Hispanized English. But then these same students who are multilingual, when they speak with other Spanish speakers in other communities, are judged to not be legitimate speakers of English, or of Spanish, excuse me. So both because they have this hybrid variety, and they don't adhere to what we might consider the standard or the prestigious norms, they're excluded and from different opportunities. And so those are just a few ways where we see the power of language to marginalize different groups based on the variety that they speak. But we can also think about how we use language to position people, and the ways that we label people. And so we can think of this with immigrants. I feel like we've seen a trajectory and how we've talked about immigrants to the United States. Kate referenced this with the example of her father and how he was positioned, but even the terminology that we apply to them, right? At one point we were using the word aliens or illegal immigrants, and right, what does that do? How does that position an individual versus saying an immigrant without documentation or an undocumented, right? So we can think about that. We can also think about this related to individuals with disabilities and the different terminology that has been used. And again, this all circles back to the fact that language is used to communicate what we value and how we see the world, right? How individuals with disabilities were positioned and seen 50 years ago is very different than how we are incorporating individuals with disabilities and how they form an integral part of our society now. And our language has adapted to reflect that reality. And so as we think about social justice education, as we kind of step back to the second part of that question, right, Kate, you asked us about these two different roles and how they connect then to social justice education. What we really want for our students is we want for them to become aware of the power of language, right? To think about the words that they're choosing. But we also want them to question and to interrogate the unconscious or implicit associations that they're making with certain language varieties or linguistic traits. And we then finally, I think the third thing, and this gets into the many different languages that we see in communities that Lauren was talking about with French, that we want them to realize that all language varieties are valid. They're rule governed. They're not just happenstance, right? There are rules that govern the patterns, the linguistic patterns within those language, and that one is not inherently better than the other. The languages in and of themselves are all equal. What ends up happening is it's the societal values that get embedded into those languages that end up marginalizing different groups. And so we want to raise student awareness about that and have them start questioning and thinking about what they can do in response.
Yeah, and I was going to add, Mandy, that I think that questioning and thinking is a pathway to action. And so when we think about, the components of social justice pedagogy, which we aren't really getting into today, but one of the key components is action. And so equipping students with the knowledge and ability to take action in whatever form it might take is key to exactly what you're talking about, right? Yeah, sort of the next logical step. So Helena, I think I jumped on you there. So
no, I was inspired by Mandy's comments and thinking about the importance of needing to make students aware of these issues. And not only, we're aware somewhat to some extent of some of the issues with language, perhaps in our own culture and in our own language, but that, that many of these things are happening in other languages. And one example was coming to mind from the German language in this movement towards gender neutral language. And here again, we're familiar with the debates over the use of the pronoun they for non-binary individuals and other similar ways to include people in English, but these debates become even more complex sometimes in languages where grammatical gender is active. So in German, for example, there's currently quite a large ongoing debate surrounding job titles, and job titles or other sort of personal descriptors are marked doubly for gender. And for example, a male student is called der Student. So der is the marker showing that that's a male. That refers to a male student. A female student, on the other hand, would be called die Studentin. So we have this double marking where not only the article, the is different, der, die, but then you also add on this affix, in, to the end of the word. And it's the same for many job categories in German. So you can also think about things like der Professor, a male professor, or die Professorin, a female professor. And they've been in Germany and German-speaking countries grappling with this and thinking about different ways to do this. There have been some suggestions made that have gained traction, such as calling all students something like Studierende, which removes the female affix and comes up with a neutral alternate term. But then you still run into the der versus die masculine gender article. And what gets even more challenging is that in German, the adjectives inflect to agree with gender and case. And so you can have things like ein guter Student is a good male student, and eine gute Studentin is a good female student. And what do you do there if you're trying to work towards a gender neutral language? So some people have proposed placing X's in place of the case endings on articles and adjective endings, and that might work really well in writing, but how do you do that when you're speaking? And I think, that gender neutral language is essential for inclusion, but how to adequately express things can be very complex, and it's different in different languages. So making students aware of these complexities in the languages that they are learning and how the people that speak these languages are grappling with these challenges is, I think, useful in increasing students' awareness of the need for gender neutral language and the centrality of this globally. And I think it's also important for students to understand why the movement towards gender neutral language is an important issue. And I think, again, this brings us, as we keep saying, full circle back to the fact that language is powerful and can be used to include or exclude people in many ways.
Your example, Helena, makes me think of the work of a colleague in French named Chris Nisley. He's at the University of Arizona, and he's been doing some really important work on non-binary language and study of trans people and in French and what their preferences are for pronoun use and so on and so forth. But from his research, he's created a couple of infographics about strategies for avoiding gender-specific language in French that include using epicens, which are words that can be either both masculine or feminine, or using words like person or human instead of mankind, that kind of thing. But also some circumlocution strategies to avoid this grammatical gender issue altogether. It's fascinating, the work that he's done, and it's super practical the way that he's put it into these infographics that both teachers and students can use to help navigate the complexities of this important inclusion work, right? Yeah. Okay, great. So we'll move on to our fourth question, which is, why are language courses an important site for exploring social justice issues? So Helena's going to start off by sort of talking about general education goals and responsibilities in relation to this question. So go ahead, Helena.
Right. And I just, highlighted the one very specific example from the German language of how social justice can be brought into the language classroom when looking at gender markers. But I think that the answer is in fact much broader than that. And really, I truly feel that social justice is everyone's responsibility. It is a part of all lives and disciplines. Every society confronts issues of social justice. And we have to remember too, that education is itself also inherently political, as teachers guide students into ways of thinking and decide what content students interact with, what ways of communicating are important, and so on. And every discipline or content area can either reproduce or contest knowledge in power dynamics. World languages are no different. In fact, I think the first question that many ask is, what languages get taught and which do not, and why? But no matter the language, wherever that language is spoken, there are issues of social justice that can be addressed, analyzed, and understood in our language classrooms. And understanding these social justice issues from multiple cultural and linguistic perspectives is crucial to understanding their pervasive and systemic nature. And I think sort of a second thing is that social justice issues also come into the classrooms with our students. They affect how our students learn, how they interact with each other, and how they interact with the material that is presented to them. And to not acknowledge this or think about that or take that into account is inauthentic and is counter to what our goal is when we are teaching languages, particularly when we attempt to do this through critical and culturally responsive pedagogies as we do here.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add on to what Helena was just saying, but I think that the language classroom is such a rich site for exploration of different perspectives, because we're already doing so much of the work of looking at different cultural perspectives. And I think understanding different experiences, different perspectives is so crucial to social justice education. So I think sort of the language classroom has some really unique opportunities in terms of weaving that in more closely to instruction. And I also think that this is important in terms of our responsibilities to our students. We're teaching courses, at least in our context here at the post-secondary level, we're teaching adults. And I think we really need to meet our adult students where they're at in terms of their intellectual curiosity. And at least from my experience, my students, many of them are very interested and eager to engage in critical thinking and critical discussions of social justice, even in their language classes. And I think we need to offer them this opportunity. And like I said, just meet them where they're at. And I mentioned this earlier as well, but I also think that students deserve to have their identities, or at least sort of pieces of their identities and the communities that they come from, reflected in the content that they're learning. I think it's important for students to be able to see themselves in the language communities that we're teaching about, and build connections or understandings, perhaps even empathy with those communities, and maybe see possibilities for themselves being part of those communities at some point in the future.
Yeah, I love this question. because I think a lot of people come into studying a language with one idea of what they're going to learn, right? And it's maybe that idea, using Meredith's phrase from the very, very beginning, and she introduced it, it's that idea that they've had passed down from their parents, that I'm going to learn verb conjugations and I'm going to learn some new vocabulary. But I think you'd be hard pressed at this point in time to find a language educator, a language teacher who says, yes, that's all that we do in language classes. Our goals are much broader for our students. And a few years back, there was a group, a partnership that worked together to identify the 21st century skills. And we in language education are really addressing all of these very broad, really important skills that individuals need to be global citizens. And so in addition to building communication skills and cultural awareness and global awareness, we're really developing students' ability to think critically, to problem solve, to collaborate, to be leaders, to be socially responsible. We're developing their multiple literacy. So we're helping them use different modalities to work across different genres in different areas. We're encouraging them to be creative and innovative. So we really are not just teaching language. We're not just teaching the mechanics of a language. We're really trying to open the world to them. And so in order to meet those really big, really ambitious goals that we have in education, we have to have students engaging with the cultural products, the cultural practices and perspectives from other communities. And so they've got to move beyond their here and now, their daily experiences, to think about those of other communities. And obviously we do this for the communities that speak the language that we teach. And so when we engage students with these big engaging themes or topics, they get to see how the varied lives and experiences of speakers of any given language. They can explore how different historical events have contributed to the different ways that individuals live within a community. They can explore different social dynamics and different social structures. And they can also explore different identities and social meanings that are indexed through languages. And we can't do that by only presenting one perspective. And I feel like we've talked about that a lot throughout the webinar, how we really have to show the diversity of the communities that speak the languages that we're teaching. And so we've been very broad in how we've talked about this today. And for those of you who aren't teaching in a language classroom, you might be saying, yeah, this all sounds really good, but how do you do this, right? Like, what does this look like? And so I was thinking about this a little, and I'm going to give an example. For a very common, and I would say one of the most, maybe people's favorite topic in language classes, which is food. Right. And so we don't just teach our students anymore how to talk about the food that they eat in Minneapolis in Spanish anymore. We don't just teach them some common dishes from around the Spanish speaking world and maybe different times or different practices, ways that people eat, but rather we're introducing and asking big questions and asking our students to engage with these big questions, such as, who eats the traditional dish of this country and who doesn't eat it and why? Who gets their food at the supermarket and who goes to the market and who maybe goes to different little businesses, or who grows it and why? Why are these different groups in different areas and why are they getting their food in different ways? How much do different products cost in different places and why do these differences exist? So we're moving from just that very basic, but to asking these big questions where students can think critically. And they can see how different social structures impact daily lives. And so really by moving students out of their comfort zone, we decenter their experience, and push them to think on a global scale. And we push them to think about difference, to ask questions, and explore all the different perspectives that are out there.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and give an example too that I think speaks to, Mandy, what you were saying and what Lauren was also saying too about students seeing themselves in the material that we're teaching in our classes. I just finished teaching a course called Linguistic Analysis of French. And typically in French linguistics, you know, the French of France is the starting point for doing linguistic analysis. And I wanted to move away from that to an extent in this course. And so we did a unit on French in the world. And I realized that many of my students didn't even know that French was spoken in so many different places in the world. And they were not aware of the colonial history that contributed to that. And so one of their projects in the course was to research an area of the French-speaking world and to describe the variety of French spoken there. And what was really interesting about it was that many of the students, particularly ones who were working on varieties in countries where where they were in contact with other languages, talked about those other languages and the different dialects that were influenced by French, and sort of the intersections between the indigenous languages or the pre-existing languages and French in those communities. And so it was fascinating to see them digging like that and becoming aware of that colonial history and speaking directly to it by uplifting languages that tend not to get mentioned within the context of a French language or linguistics class. Another project that they had to do was a self-directed research project. And one student who's a heritage speaker of Spanish, researched a phenomenon that exists in both French and Spanish and did a comparative analysis of these forms of the dialectal Spanish, dialectal French. And so that student was able, like you said, Lauren, to sort of see himself in the content of the course and his own linguistic background, and sort of getting back to this idea of what's at the heart of you. They were able to bring that in to this research project and really personalize it. So there's been some questions in the Q&A about examples of how we might do this and address issues of colonialism and marginalized varieties. So I wanted to throw that in there. I know it wasn't part of our planning, but I thought it could be useful. So I think I'm going to stop our part of the discussion now and move on to some of the questions that you've been asking in the Q&A. And I want to thank everybody. You've been making some wonderful comments in there and sharing some of your own personal experiences, but also asking some really good and some tough questions. We're not going to have time to get to all of them. There's a couple that I absolutely want to get to that I think are relevant for the things that we've talked about today. So let me just scroll down. Okay, so the first question is about plurilingualism in the US or multilingualism in the US. So the question is, I'm curious as to what any of you think we can do to increase the number of institutions fostering and using plurilingualism here in the United States. In my personal experience, the Alliance Française has been useful supplementing my high school and college French experience, but it was so France-centered and neglected other Francophone cultures. Most people are not connected to such institutions, however, and I wish more people were. So just thoughts about how we might be able to increase awareness around multilingualism here in the United States and perhaps through our work with social justice. Any thoughts about that?
I don't know if I have a fully formed answer to this yet, but I will make an attempt. So I think this is a conversation that is particularly going on in dual language immersion, which is not an area that I am an expert in at all or know that much about. But I think trying to find ways to, how can I say this, look at the languages that are used in those environments in an equitable manner, and not sort of like privileging one over another. And also, I think just in terms of increasing awareness of plurilingualism, I think our language classes are a great site for that too. I think that's why language education is so important, to sort of having this experience that takes you out of your comfort zone, really, and sort of puts you in the shoes of someone who may not speak the same language as you. So I don't know if that answers the part about different institutions that could do that, but I do think, supporting language education and encouraging language education is definitely a major piece of that.
I'm thinking about this even more broadly, and English is so dominant here in the US, but slowly but surely we're seeing signage, right, in different institutions that recognize that we don't live in a monolingual community or in a monolingual society. So like, I think this could really be very broad. And we can think about, medical facilities, educational facilities, business facilities, community centers, right? All of these different places, and recognizing how we can invite people into that space by acknowledging that there are other languages out there and not prohibiting the use of other languages. And I think this is we've seen this a lot in education. Lauren, you brought that up with the dual language immersion, but I even just think about in our K-12 schools that are not dual language schools, when they send communications home to parents in the parents' home language, right? I mean, I think that recognizes and invites them in a little bit more than always sending everything home in English. I also recognize that is hard for schools that may not have an individual that works within the district and have translators. But I do think that if the more we can recognize and value the different perspectives and languages and what that contributes to our society as a whole, the more, right, once you kind of get that ball rolling, the bigger it becomes and the more it can take on.
So I think we have time for one more question. And there's so many good questions on here, and I wish we had time to address all of them. So thank you again, everybody, for your input. But this is a sort of a more practical kind of on the ground question that I think is important. We've encountered this issue ourselves in our work, and so I think it'll be a good one for us to talk about. And so the question is, how might a teacher who acquired a language as a second language and might not be familiar with the political relationship between what counts as a named language versus a dialect, such as the dominant language of Spanish versus indigenous languages in Mexico, how can they bring this discussion into their classroom with learners who are also unfamiliar with these relationships? So it's sort of a question about our knowledge base and how can we and our students feel confident in our ability to tackle these complex issues when we don't necessarily have the expertise to do so. This is a question that comes up a lot in professional development that we do related to teaching content. And so I appreciate this question, and that's why I wanted to throw it out to you guys.
I mean, when it first comes to mind, because you're right, Kate, this is a question that comes up quite a bit. And a lot of things we talk about, not just social justice, but other types of content that we might not feel to be the expert. And are we the expert? And do we know enough to even be talking about this? And I think in the past, it's been a hindrance. People have been afraid to bring things into the classroom because they didn't feel to be the expert. And that is important, and I think we do know quite a bit, but I think it's also important to go in and learn together with your students and to sometimes take yourself out, and you don't always have to be the expert, the educator coming in here with the knowledge that you're going to impart. I think it's important to have a dialogue by bringing the issues that that you've done some research on into the classroom. You can have a discussion with your students. And as you were talking about some of the projects you were doing in your class, Kate, I mean, getting students to go out and do research, and they're bringing in knowledge that they're learning, and we're all learning together, and to create that kind of learning environment, I think is extremely powerful. And, students have more agency in that. And I think that can be really great for learning as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also think trusting the content that we're bringing into the classroom as providing the expertise, and then equipping students with the ability to analyze that content, yes, to understand or to try to get at the practices and the perspectives that are related within that content, right? Well, so we are at the top of the hour, and we want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you so much for being here today. At one point, there were 187 people in this webinar, so we really appreciate your interest and enthusiasm and your willingness to stick around for the entire hour. I just want to let you know that this webinar was recorded, and you will receive a message in the coming days with a link to that recording. So if you want to revisit the webinar, you will be able to do that. And just keep an eye out for future M Global Presents webinars in the next academic year. I'm not sure if any will be taking place over the summer, but certainly the webinar series will be picked up again in the fall. So thank you again very much, and have a great day. Bye, everybody.